a very warm welcome to all of you. You have joined us at Youth Employment UK for this session on breaking down barriers and how we support young people who face poverty on their journey into employment. And I'm delighted to be hosting this session for a topic that is particularly close and dear to my own heart. Just a bit of housekeeping before we really get into it. Please do keep your microphones muted during the session. You're going to hear from myself and another speaker, and for the purposes of us being able to complete a train of thought, it'd be great if we don't have too much disruption in the background. We do have a Q&A feature though, so you can ask and upvote onto questions that we might be posing throughout the session. If you have any difficulty hearing the discussion, please do check your computer, but Georgia Williamson from the Youth Employment UK team is on hand for any tech issues. We are, of course, recording this webinar, and it will be shared along with the presentation slides and any notes that come from it on our website, probably by about Thursday lunchtime this week. Keep your camera on or off, whichever you're most comfortable for. We do appreciate, though, everyone introducing themselves. Georgia has gone first in the chat function. Please do use the chat function to get to know colleagues in and around the room. Share who you are, which organisation you're calling from, and it'd be great to see you when we call out any questions later on. So, as we move into this, without further ado, as you've heard, I am Laura Jane Rawlings. I'm the Chief Exec here at Youth Employment UK, and I'm joined by Lynn Perry, the CEO of Barnardo's, who is our resident expert for this particular session. And why Youth Employment UK are hosting this. For some of you, you might be new to Youth Employment UK and to the webinars and content that we produce. So I thought it would just be useful to give you a quick whistle stop of who we are and why we're hosting today. So Youth Employment UK is the national body for youth employment. We have been in around since 2012, where we had the last significant spike of young people not in education, employment or training back in 2011, 2012, where we had 1 million of those young people NEET. And since then, we've been working with young people, with employers and with national and local policymakers and stakeholders to really better understand the system issues of youth unemployment, so better understand the barriers and experiences of young people and of employers, and to try and bring about solutions to all of those stakeholders. So we have a significant role in the national system, but also at a very place-based level. One of our most important stakeholders, of course, is the young people that we work with. We do a lot of youth voice work with them, and I'm going to come on to asking you to support our current Youth Voice Census, which is the largest survey of 11 to 30-year-olds in the country and gives us huge and deeply rich insight about young people and their barriers and challenges. But we also provide young people with skills and careers content through an online platform, through the website, and we support employers through our membership, trying to help those employers better understand young people and their barriers and what good youth employment looks like. I do have colleagues from our membership team here. If membership is something of interest to you, you can reach out to the team. Josh and Gareth, I think, are on this particular chat. Also, as an organisation, Youth Employment UK are the secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Youth Employment, which has been a very significant APPG of its time. And we were co-founder and co-chair of the Youth Employment Group, which is home to some of the really brilliant policy that we've seen in the youth employment space over the last number of years. I'm privileged to say that the Youth Employment Group has had a real impact in working with DWP on tackling youth unemployment, not least through recommendations such as Kickstart back in 2020, and most recently the Youth Guarantee, where we're still currently advising, forming and shaping that policy with the DWP and DFE teams. So a huge role to play in that national policy. And why it matters still today? Well, sadly to report, we're back to nearly 1 million young people who are NEET again, with 957,000 young people aged 16 to 24 in the NEET category. And why that is so significant, you know, particularly when I think about where we started in 2012, I really think the complexity of that NEET group has got more so. I think the challenges and the barriers that they have seen over the last 10 years in particular have really made this a complex issue to solve. When we think about some of those things that we've seen, we sort of saw back in the early 2012 era, the issues of austerity, where we saw local authority services cut at quite significant levels, authority services that had statutory duty for some of our most vulnerable young people within our communities, really losing sort of real-time funding, growth in those local areas. We move on then to seeing the challenges of education and skills reform through a more targeted curriculum on academic and the baccalaureate focus, to also changes to the apprenticeship system of the introduction to the apprenticeship levy back in 2014. To them, we saw the impact that COVID had on a huge generation of young people who were left, whatever their ages and stages across that period of time, were left in very isolated conditions that are still having a bearing on them as they move through the education system and now into employment. We have seen further impacts of austerity and the growth of poverty and the number of young children living in poverty across the nation. And now we're in that cost of living crisis too, where that's having a real bearing on young people and the opportunity they've got to access the routes into further education, training and employment. And we're going to get into some of that in today's discussion, but it really does, for me, sort of play a picture as to why youth unemployment is so complicated, because of all of these factors that have been at play over the last 10 years in particular. And there's many more that I just don't have time to get into on this particular webinar. We do see and know that poverty is a multiplier for some young people. So there is an absolute still growing divide between those that have and those that have not in this country, particularly those young people who live in poverty don't perhaps have the opportunity to see work in certain ways or have connections into work. We did a very interesting study on the role of the family and social mobility a number of years ago. And that's still that transference of social, economic and cultural capital that young people who live in affluent families have really still plays out in the job market as tight as it is today, and the impact it has on those young people that don't have that family equity. So we're going to dig into some of that. We also know here at Youth Employment UK, through our Youth Voice census work, that there is a real psychological toll on young people right now. They know it's hard and they know it's challenging. And our 2025 census found an absolute generation of young people saying, nah, why bother? It doesn't really matter if you work really hard, because actually the outcome is still that there are less jobs for young people, there are less employers that want them, there are less opportunities for us in the system. And we're starting to see that play out in terms of well-being, confidence, motivation to take those next steps. So some real challenges play out in this landscape. Which brings me brilliantly into the work that Barnardo's are playing and the things that you're seeing, Lynn, across your networks. Let's dig into your expertise at Barnardo's. I'll let you present, and then what we're going to do is, when you've kind of shared the state of the nation as Barnardo's see it, you and I are going to have a bit of a conversation about what that might really mean for employers and the actors who are in this webinar today. So over to you, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks very much, LJ. Really great to be here today. I'm Lynn Perry, Chief Executive at Barnardo's, and I've spent my entire career prior to being Chief Executive working in children's services with children, young people, families who are in need of support. So one of the things that I think is quite interesting about the particular context, and you've talked about it already, is this generation of young people who have been impacted by both the long shadow of COVID, but also hard on the heels of that, another cost of living crisis. So the prevalence of poverty and the way that that is showing up in our services, I think is something which affords us a level of insight. So just for colleagues who are less familiar with Barnardo's, we run around 650 services across the UK for children, young people and families. And we've been around for 160 years now. For a lot of people, the name Barnardo's is synonymous with children's homes. But interestingly, our founder, Thomas Barnardo, established a school before he established a children's home. And that was very much rooted in a recognition that work and the development of skills was the route out of very long-term poorer outcomes as a result of poverty for children and young people who perhaps didn't have a level of family support. So this is very congruent with our history, very true to our roots, and we currently run a range of employment training and skills services, which I'll say a little bit about. But critically for today, I think the intersection with poverty is what I will focus on. And often I think when we talk about employment, training and skills, what we're really focused on is those hard outcomes at the end point where we see young people in jobs, in apprenticeships, in training. And of course, all of that is the ultimate destination that we are all focused on. But at Barnardo's, what we know is that it's impossible to talk about why so many young people struggle to find and sustain work without also talking about the impact of poverty in childhood, in adolescence, at the point at which you are looking for work. And what we know from the most recent official statistics is that poverty remains a defining feature of too many children and young people's lives. I don't know if somebody could flick my slides on for me, please. That'd be super helpful. Thank you. We've got in the UK currently nearly 1 in 3 children who are living in poverty. And I think, you know, those stats are quite easy to say, and, you know, it would be easy to move on to the next point. But what's really important for me is to just centre for a moment on what does that experience look and feel like for children and young people. So, you know, that might be waking up in a cold home. It might be having insufficient school uniform. It might be poor nutrition as a result of families not having enough money to put nutritious food down on the table for children. It's not, you know, none of those things can fail to impact on a child's experience. And for every statistic, there is a child who is missing out on the childhood that they deserve and not being unable to fulfill their potential. And I think it's really important to just really reflect on that child's experience rather than just be focused on some of those statistics. And it's not just a problem for today. So here at Barnardo's, I often hear the phrase, you know, childhood lasts a lifetime. And I think that's really true when we think about some of the quite pernicious and pervasive impacts of poverty. We know statistically that children born into poverty are more likely to struggle in education, including sometimes being behind in those very early years. And it's really difficult at that point for children and young people to catch up. So the impact of that lower attainment at school, leaving education often with fewer qualifications, can have a lasting, lifelong impact. And poor educational outcomes, we know, anybody who's working in this field knows, is one of the strongest predictors of not ending up in positive education, employment, training, destinations later in life. So there is a real, both a moral and a fiscal case for tackling some of the barriers that child poverty presents for children and young people. And we see the impact of it every single day across our 650 services. Poverty shaping their health, shaping their education, their expectations and aspirations, and the opportunities that they will put themselves forward for in that context. And that's before you get anywhere near, a job centre, a college, a prospective workplace. Because poverty is one of the things I think that shapes beliefs. for children and young people, that internal narrative about what the art of the possible might look like for you. And it was really interesting hearing some of your stats earlier, LJ. We did some recent polling with YouGov. 1,000 children aged between the ages of 5 and 15. And what that polling demonstrated was just how many children already feel disillusioned about their employment prospects. And that was, long before they were finishing school. 78% of children had agreed with the statement that they would be able to find a job only 78% of children agreed with the statement they'd be able to find a job they enjoyed when they were older. And 15% actively disagreed with that statement altogether. So we talk about, at Barnardo's, we have a value here, which is working with hope. And it's quite clear that for a lot of children and young people, they do not feel hopeful that they are going to find work that they are going to be able to enjoy and also prosper in. So, I think, you talked about your forthcoming survey. One of the things that I think is really important is that we keep those voices, experiences, and insights from young people at the heart of everything that we do. Now, at Barnardo's, our work is focused principally on those young people who we might describe as being furthest from the labour market as a result of a whole host of social and personal challenges. Those factors include things like homelessness, experience of the care system, children and young people facing mental health challenges, those who may have low educational attainment, and also, of course, very specific groups like young people with a lot of caring responsibilities within their home lives. And if we flick on to my next slide, I talked about our early history as a charity. One of the things that Thomas Barnardo recognised was the importance of working with those children who had experienced disadvantage, to try and support them to develop the skills that they needed in order to go on into employment. So we have a great archive here at Barnardo's, and within that archive you can see some fabulous pictures of young people who've learnt trades in carpentry and joinery and all sorts of different trades of the day. And, to go full circle, really, we are still doing some of that work here today. The first boys' school that Barnardo's established offered young men the opportunity to develop skills in metalwork, shoemaking, the trades of the day. And for young girls and women, they were also prepared for a life in employment. So in many respects, we were at the cutting edge of employment training and skills work 150 years or more ago. And now today we run employment training and skills services that have supported over 3,000 young people across 20 specialist hubs, helping them to build the confidence and the ambition, as well as the knowledge and the skills that they need to enter into the workplace, and also to sustain and progress in employment. Many of the children and young people that we work with here around employment training and skills are really highly motivated. They are incredibly resilient and resourceful young people, and they are ambitious, but they face significant barriers, and it's some of those barriers that impact their ambition. So the important thing in that context, of course, is for us to be really clear-eyed about what the barriers are, and to seek to tackle them head on in our work. The first thing that I would say that has led to some real success for us is recognising, as I said at the beginning, that this is not just about getting young people into places of work. It's about how do we create holistic and tailored packages of support that give young people the confidence to cross the threshold in the first place, and then to deal with some of the barriers and challenges and issues that might present for them. So that relational based one-to-one support is something that has been really fundamental to our success here. We know that for lots of young people that we work with, the barriers aren't just about skills or motivation. They're about a whole range of practical obstacles and issues. So I'll talk a little bit to some of those just to help, give a flavour of some of what we're doing that we think has made a real difference here. So that dedicated worker, that single point of contact, knowing that you've got somebody, who is backing you and showing up for you and will help you with resolution of some of those issues has been absolutely critical. Lots of the young people that we work with at Barnardo's have experienced instability. They might have had discontinuity of support and relationships, and so fundamentally that's one of the things that is an anchor for them and supports them to be successful. One of the other things that we found really important to focus on is a really strong emphasis on well-being and a sense of confidence and self-esteem entering into the workplace. So our colleagues working on employment training and skills are also supported and trained to work in what we describe here as a trauma-informed way, ways that recognise some of the challenges and experiences of the young people that we are working with. Alongside that, because of some of the discontinuity that I referenced earlier, there are some real basic building blocks for young people that they have told us have been important for them in the work that we've done with them, around things like establishing routines, establishing self-belief, helping them to manage at points when a lack of motivation might kick in. Let's keep it real. Who doesn't have, those days when you think, gosh, this is a long day ahead. There might be some difficulties in it. I've got some tough conversations or, things to do that I've never done before. But working with young people around, how to keep themselves motivated and embrace some of those things as new opportunities is something that they've told us has also been really important for them. Preparing emotionally for that transition into work and how you manage some of those difficult situations that you may have never managed previously. So some of that work is really foundational, but then there's also some really practical stuff that is difficult for children and young people who are experiencing poverty. So I'll talk a little bit about one of our partnerships shortly, but one of the things that we've built into our jobs project, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment, is access to something that's called a Springboard Fund. So for lots of young people that we work with here at Barnardo's, they cannot afford public transport to get to an interview. They cannot afford public transport to do 2 weeks of work experience. And if they have to take a lunch, that's further expense still. If they need the right footwear for a particular work experience or job role, more expense still. And many of the young people we work with, they can't afford that. If you think about care experienced young people, for example, what they told us is, we do not have the bank of mum and dad to fall back on. And so for that first month, when somebody is entering into employment, or for that first fortnight, if they're doing work experience, they might need some very tangible and practical support. I've got a son myself. He's working now. He's 21. But for lots of us, we might take our children to their first interview. We might support them into their first day at work. Or lots of the young people we work with, they don't have that. They don't have somebody waking them up with a cup of tea and wishing them well on their first day. So the relationship, the practical support, down to the detail of, have you got bus fare and a packed lunch. Those things are really important for children to feel seen and heard and supported as they enter into that world of work. And getting the job is not the end point. So how can we support young people to settle, to understand workplace cultures and conventions, and how you resolve issues or challenges, how you put yourself forward for opportunities, how you speak up in meetings when you might be afraid to do some of that. Regular check-ins are really important, and that practical and emotional support during those very, very critical early weeks is something that has really helped to sustain young people in employment in our programs. So taken together, I guess what I'm saying is, it's not just about getting young people into a job. It's about, how do we create the right preconditions to support young people, and particularly those experiencing poverty and some of the other barriers that I've talked about today, to get into work, but then also to believe that this is a place where they can succeed. Takes this sort of very holistic approach that I've sought to describe here. And one of the factors that we found to be most important is also the relationship with the employer. So the partnership between Barnardo's, the young person, and the employer is also something that we found can really supercharge the likelihood of a young person being successful once they progress into the workplace. So what I thought I might do, LJ, is just share an example of a partnership that we've had at Barnardo's that I think has demonstrated real success. I've got stats up on these slides. I'm not going to talk to them all, of course, just for the purposes of time, but I'm happy for the slides to be shared later with colleagues who are on the call. But I wanted to share an example of this project that we've been running with Amazon over a number of years now. And at the heart of this programme is a co-designed approach, co-designed with young people for young people. So one of the things that we wanted to understand was, what are the barriers as you experience them? Not that we as adults who, are in employment and have been in employment for a long time might consider them, but what are the barriers for you as young people, and how can you help us to design a programme that will help you into work and to sustain yourself in work? And the result of that partnership work with young people, with Amazon, with Barnardo's, was called the Jobs Project. Now, I went along to find out more about the Jobs Project, and I rather naively assumed that, the title gave it away, that this was all about getting young people into jobs. And young people described to me that actually jobs is about work, but what jobs stands for, it's an acronym, and it stands for the journey of becoming successful. And that was the name that young people developed for this 10-week programme, which is really all about work readiness for young people who are not in education, employment, or training. And it's a whole project that is focused around that wraparound support that I talked about, targeting, addressing those practical and personal barriers that are most likely to affect employability. So it's the building blocks of confidence, readiness, skills development, and I've just put a few bullet points on here that talk about some of the things that we do. So there's some really practical stuff around CV preparation, preparation for interviews, coaching and confidence building, helping young people to understand their personal communication styles, how they come across to others, active listening, so that you're responding to a question that's properly understood, and then some concepts that might be quite abstract for some young people about what does it mean to work in a team. And what might your employer expectations be, not just on you as an individual, but about how you work with others and how you approach things as a team. There's also opportunities in here that are focused on work experience, working with employers around the development of specific vocational employability skills. And one of the big things that really came across, I've met a lot of young people who've been on this programme now, but one of the things that a lot of those young people have talked to me about is that focus on health and well-being, and the importance of that, both physically and mentally, to sustain yourself in a job, particularly if you've been out of education for a long time, out of routine, and then suddenly you are finding yourself having to do 37 hours. You might have to walk to work, you might have to walk home. How do you sustain yourself nutritionally through all of that? But some of these modules in this 10-week programme have been the real springboard for young people to understand that's my barrier. And, those are the things that I really want to lean into by way of personal development that will also help me professionally. And suffice to say, we offer one-to-one support all the way through this project for a 12-week check-ins, because what we really want to do is make sure that somebody is on a sustainable pathway to employment. So I'll just share very briefly about a young woman who had really struggled with anxiety and had some quite poor experiences of the world of work, and just felt caught in this endless cycle. When she came on this 10-week project, what she talked about at the end of it was the growth in her confidence, but also her ability to communicate and work with others at points at which, she might have been struggling or had questions that she didn't feel she could ask. and it really sort of helped her to open up in ways that helped the employer to help her too. Now she's gone on to successfully secure a job like lots of other young people on this project. You can see the success stats here on the slide, so I won't talk to them. But it's the long-term ambition that leads from this. So I've met young people who are now well embedded into careers in childcare, in public health. You know, not everybody goes on to work in an Amazon type industry. And we've been bringing other employers into this work as well. So we're working alongside IKEA now, and we've got other offers and other employers who are really stepping up and wanting to be a part of this. So if any of you are on this call and you'd like to talk to me afterwards, then I would also be very happy to do that. But just very quickly, back in 2025, we worked with 328 young people, and 83% of them moved on to a positive destination after completing the 10-week project, with 75% of them sustaining themselves beyond the 3-month point. So, you know, I think those stats are really quite compelling. So I'm conscious of time, and I should probably wrap up at this point. But I think if we're really serious about tackling youth unemployment, we've got to be really serious about tackling child poverty. Those two things, you know, do hang together. So for me, the sort of the early intervention, the investment in holistic support for young people, and developing those effective partnerships between civil society, employers, decision makers at local and national government is really critical for us to really move the dial for young people. So it's not just about you know, tackling one of these issues. We've got to look at them as parallel lines, because it's only in doing that that we'll be able to break some of those cycles that trap young people who were born into low-income families into poverty, well into adulthood. So I could go on, but I better stop.
This is why you and I got on so very, very well when we first met. We are women of the same passion. I think just really interesting on your outcomes. I just tested my brain to test what some of the other welfare to work outcomes are, particularly some of those that are commissioned by local authorities and combined authorities. We've got quite a few of those on the call, but also, of course, DWP. And for sustained outcomes into employment for some young people who perhaps have lower complex barriers, they're only talking about 20 to 40%. So the fact that your program's got 89% positive outcome is really testimony to the expertise, the work, the care of Barnardo's and your team. So I just want to lay that out here in the session today. So this has been really interesting, and one of the reasons why poverty is very close to my heart in particular, not least because I think I was born to try and tackle youth unemployment, but also I am a child from a free school meal background and lived in some really stark moments across my childhood of living in poverty. The hunger, the lack of confidence in housing and security of our home. It was at risk, very constant. And of course, then having parents who perhaps didn't necessarily have all the social networks that could open up doors into a world of work for me was something. But actually at the time, and I was very lucky because I had two parents that loved me very much, and my parents are still around and biggest champions of me and the work that we do here. But I really think about the time, and you know, they couldn't open up the doors to work, but it was a time when actually employers were pretty happy to take on a 14 or a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old. You know, the paper round, the working as a waitress at 14, 15, which just wouldn't happen now. I could earn money very early, which was a deep factor to who I am as a person, you know, and my career that I've had. So I think about that history of mine, but also the work that we've done over the years here. And I think I want to start in the area of work experience. because actually, you know, in the census we heard last year, less than 26% of young people were able to access work experience at school. We understand that some schools, you know, they invite the children to find their own work experience. Now, given what you've just talked us through, and given my perhaps sort of link to my family growing up, that would have been impossible for some young people and some families to find their own work experience. We're talking about families who perhaps don't have links to work, or certainly not links to the work that young people want to be able to do, or those connections. And so immediately we know that young people are being disadvantaged in the school system by not having a consistent offer around work experience and connections to employers. What have you seen from employers in your network who are doing something different to include those young people in their cohorts?
So I think the work experience piece, I absolutely relate to everything that you said. And my experience was very similar, actually. You know, I didn't have anybody to open a door for me by way of a work experience opportunity. I was quite fortunate in that I'd maintained some connections at my previous school, and I didn't actually want to go into teaching, but you know, that resourcefulness that some young people have, I seemed to have a little bit of that, and I managed to secure myself you know, a little bit of work experience at school. One of the things I think would be really great to see would be a local offer of work experience for businesses, you know, for companies in local areas to think about as part of their corporate social responsibility agenda. How might they open up opportunities for young people? And of course, there's a whole raft of work that needs to be done around that. But there's also something in there for me about recognizing that not all young people might be able to do, you know, a traditional work experience, you know, full week or fortnight on the job. So, you know, at Barnardo's, we work with young people who might have caring responsibilities at home. So some flexibility around some of that. You know, could we get some short, structured work experience opportunities, you know, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, or some trial sessions, rather than expecting these kind of block commitments of a week or more that some young people just can't do, and potentially can't afford to do because of transport, or, you know, having to take packed lunches to work, some of the things I talked about earlier. But what that also does, I think, is it gives people a bite-sized opportunity to just dip their toe in and, you know, build their confidence really gradually. You know, for most of us, we'd like to think we could commit to a session, you know, but a fortnight might just be completely overwhelming. So could we get a menu, you know, within a local offer that recognises some of the additional barriers for some children and young people? So I think, you know, there's some of that. There's some of the stuff that we want, you know, as employees, and that we think about as employers for our, you know, for our paid colleagues, about flexible work patterns, part-time hours, later start times, you know, all of those things I think can be equally helpful for young people who might be managing challenges with their mental health. You know, they might be overwhelmed by appointments that they've got to deal with, you know, other areas in their lives. So I think there's a few things in there. And then the final thing for me that I think we've seen work has been the workplace buddy. So, you know, having a consistent person who you can go to as a single point of contact, you know, that will tell you there's no stupid question, you know, just come to me. So those navigators, I think, in the workplace, who, you know, who really want to back young people. We know who those champions are. Can we actually give them some formal responsibility and, you know, maybe even recognition for doing some of that work that adds so much value to companies?
That's really helpful insight. And interestingly, so at Youth Employment UK, we are providing employers with guidance on how to be an inclusive, youth-friendly employer. We have huge amounts of toolkits on work experience. Is here. And actually, one of the things that we talk to you about employers is thinking about your target schools. So sometimes employers will just go to local schools. Actually, if you're not looking at the makeup of your local primary or secondary schools to see the population of free school meals, which is available through the school website, through their Ofsted reports, that's when you can start to really target higher needs areas and schools who might have a higher percentage in population of free school meal young people. So it means you are naturally targeting those local schools and colleges or to support them. We also agree in terms of the flexibility, and actually the Careers and Enterprise Company, who are one of our partners, have developed a new model of work experience called EqualX, which is about saying, actually, we know 2 weeks is good, but it can be 2 weeks over the span of 3 or 4 year groups. So actually doing that one day taster, having a bit of mentoring, having some employers come in, some of that activity can really build and blend into a really quality exposure to the world of work. So there's some really great stuff in that EqualX model. And one of the other things that we did here too last year as part of Youth Employment Week, which is in July, was we created a resource for employers called Do One Thing. And it's a bit of a survey quiz. Georgia, can you put it into the chat function for me? And it essentially asks employers, if you've only got an hour, here's something that you could do. Just to your point, Lynn, if you've got half a day, if you've got a day, employers don't always have the big time to do the big stuff, but there is a lot of practical things that employers can do. So yeah, you can look at where your free school meal proportions are. You can stop inviting. In fact, one of our members, who I thought this was brilliant, they were only offering work experience where a member of staff asked if they could bring their son or daughter into work. So because that's not particularly inclusive, that absolutely does exclude young people who are advantage from entering your workplace. One of their tactics was, if you want your son or daughter to come and work in your department to gain some work experience, you need to create another opportunity within the organisation for somebody who is not familiar linked to us. And so therefore we're opening up the opportunity for more inclusion. So that was a really nice one. That we are our employers away from having their own children coming in for work experience, because again, it sets this precedent, right, that actually we're excluding so many. Let's move on. I'm conscious of time. Let's move on to, we talk a lot too about the financial and practical obstacles, so I'm so glad you brought that up. When we think about paying for travel, paying for, a nice set of clothes to go to an interview, or a set of clothes to do your work in, paying for lunches, I have to give my daughter £20 a week to catch the bus to college. Now, for a family in poverty, there is not £20 a week spare. And it is just the most practical of barriers. I'm also paying for her £350 a month for her driving lessons. For families who face financial barriers, travel is just the most expensive thing. So in addition to your fund, what else have you seen employers do to recognise and remove that financial barrier to the first job, the first opportunity?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a couple of things really. There's one thing for me which is around, in a lot of our work, a lot of people will be really familiar with the practice of equality impact assessments. And one of the things I think that any employer can look at is, what is the impact of our current set of policies in relation to socioeconomic inequalities, and how does that impact us getting young people into this place of work? I was at the Resolve Poverty Conference recently, and they've got some really good toolkits to support around some of this work. And I've heard it described as poverty proofing activity and offers, and I think it's something that employers could definitely look at. But having that sort of upfront consideration of travel costs, uniforms, can you provide some basic kit? it doesn't have to be, for work experience, for example, you could just have a cloakroom of it, so that when young people come in, they are able to avail themselves of the appropriate kit. It might be around, interviews for young people. So, in some of our services, for example, we've had a running rail of suitable interview clothing, going back a number of years now. And since then, we've evolved into, providing young people with support to go and buy things for an interview. And but just some of those really practical things have proven to be absolutely critical in enabling young people to engage. I think there are some other things as well, though, that are just worth kind of pausing on, that aren't necessarily financial, but that are structural barriers for young people. So, and some of this actually, is about experience and opportunity that not everybody will have had an opportunity to, to experience. So, I think there's opportunity for entry-level jobs in particular to think about the CV requirements. Now, I look at some jobs, some entry-level jobs, and I think, good grief, for some people, they could have been in the world of work for quite some time and still not be able to fulfill all of those requirements. So how do we really focus in on what is absolutely essential, and think about, other things like motivation, interest, recruiting for potential is one of the things that, we talk about a lot here. How are we creating barriers to entry through things like formal interview processes for some young people? So we did a piece of work in one of the London boroughs actually some time ago, and we were recruiting young people into our team to help us with this work. And they were young people that we'd worked with for some time. And they came to us and said, do we really have to fill out, this massive application form that's asking us a load of questions that we probably can't populate, with answers? Could we not approach this from a different angle? Because what we'd like to do is a short film. We'd like to do a piece to video to demonstrate to you our capabilities to lead on this project, and we think that will highlight some of the skills and talent that you're looking for in this role. So we stepped back and we thought about that, and we changed the process to support those young people to be able to engage in that. Now, we can do that. They were Barnardo's young people. They were applying for roles that that we were leading on. But it really spoke to me about how thoughtful we need to be. And what is the skill set that young people have got today? They were fantastic filmmakers. Their presentation skills were superb. They were confident presenters. And actually, that was the skill set we were looking for, but we've gone out with a formal written application form. So there's also that bit about, do your processes square up with some of those opportunities? So I think there's a number of things that we can do that recognise not all young people start at the same place, and to try and level that playing field a little bit. And it's not just about financial challenge, although that is a big part of it.
Yeah, and I was going to come on to that application process, because you're absolutely right. I think we get inclusion really wrong in this country. We talk a lot about inclusion, and then when you walk back to the job application, how you might find about the job, the specifications going on. We already know that nearly half of young people won't pass English and maths first time, their GCSEs, they won't be able to necessarily move on to post-16 pathways. Apprenticeships won't necessarily support them because of the English and maths requirements. And we are talking there about the most disadvantaged young people who will have talents elsewhere. And yet we always default back to the way we've always done things when it comes to job specs and person specification. So we've got a lot of guidance for employers on job specs. And actually we did a piece of work with our youth ambassadors on job specs. And, they were allergic to things like fast-paced environment and excellent communication skills, language that we think's attractive and fun and relevant. For some young people, actually, that puts up immediate barriers, as do sometimes the line managers in the hiring seats who haven't had inclusion training or haven't joined this webinar and who are still looking for, using a set of questions that might be only appropriate for a very finite group of young people. So it's also how we train our line managers. Now, I am deeply conscious of time because I never finish a webinar late. Lynn, you have been rather marvellous, and I could sit and ask you more and more questions, but we just simply don't have time if I'm going to get these good people off to their lunch. But there's a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if you would like to just pick those up while you are here, just while I round up this webinar. Colleagues, this has been one of the fastest hours of my week so far, but certainly has been a fascinating and thought-filled session with such an expert organisation as Barnardo's, and no wonder with over 160 years worth of legacy of training and delivery in the organisation. So huge thanks to Lynn for joining us. We're going to be putting this webinar, the recording, the slides, and further notes and guidance on our website. That will be up by Thursday lunchtime this week. So do take a look out for it. But it would not be appropriate for me to let you go without reminding you that we are now capturing this year's Youth Voice census data. So we are asking young people aged 11 to 30 to take part in this year's Youth Voice census. As Lynn and I have both expressed, you cannot design policy, you cannot be an expert in a room about young people without listening to them and putting their voices first. So please, colleagues, we do encourage you to take part in this year's Youth Voice census. You can give your young people in your organisations an hour to complete it at some point between now and June when it closes, or you can simply promote it across your socials and your networks. My team are also travelling the country to meet young people in person. We're going to 6 combined authorities this year to do some in-person sessions. If you are an organisation that hosts young people and you'd like to see us, we would be very up for coming and doing a visit with your young people in your settings. We are going to West Yorkshire, we're going to Greater Manchester, we're going to West Midlands, we're going to Cambridge and Peterborough, we're going to the North East Combined Authority, and we're going to the West of England Combined Authority. If you have settings in one of those 6 Combined Authority sessions, please get in touch with the team. We'd love to come to you. I've talked a bit about the benefits of our membership for employers, not least it's accessing resources, previous webinars, guides, how-tos, case studies, data, insight around good youth employment practice, but employers can also complete and commit to our good youth employment standards. So membership is something for you to have a think about. And then finally, any questions, any takeaways, you can contact the Youth Employment UK team always. Again, huge thanks to Lynn for your time today. You have been an absolute pleasure. We will be working together, I hope, in many other ways in the future. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm giving you a minute back. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.